Welcome to episode 6 of the Global Dialogues on Community Media in the Post-Pandemic World, a series of discussions that the UNESCO Chair on Community Media has been curating and hosting in collaboration with the UNESCO Regional Office in New Delhi. For this particular event today, with its focus on Southeast Asia and the Pacific, we are privileged to have the partnership of Amarc Asia Pacific, the Asia Pacific section of the World Association of Community Radio Broadcasters. To those of you who don't know the acronym, we are thankful to the president of Amarc Asia Pacific, Dr. Ram Bhatt, and to Suman Basnet, the regional coordinator of Amarc Asia Pacific, for readily agreeing to join hands with the chair in putting together this dialogue. As some of you who are regular participants in the global dialogues know, we have been listening to community radio practitioners, advocates, and activists from South Asia, Australia, the UK and Ireland, Eastern and Southern Africa, and during the last dialogue we had participants from Western and Central Africa. They have not only been sharing their experiences about the incredible work being done during the current pandemic crisis by community radio stations in those regions, but also offering their insights on the future of community radio more generally. As we invite some very important community radio practitioners and advocates from Indonesia, the Philippines, Thailand, Japan, and Fiji today, I cannot but remember the legendary late Louis Tabing, who with his pioneering Tambuli project in the Philippines had captured the imagination of community media activists in the region and outside the region as well. His 2002 primer, How to Do Community Radio, published by UNESCO New Delhi, is still a valuable publication for anyone who dreams of starting a community radio station. Louis used to talk passionately of community radio in the Philippines and elsewhere in the region as a counterpoint to what it used to call the 5 Ps of mainstream media. The 5 Ps, according to Louis, were profit, propaganda, power, politics, and privilege. And counter these 5 Ps with 2 critical Ps of community media, which is people and participation. Over the years, community radio in these parts of the world, including the Pacific, has held out the promise of reaching the unreached. There are any number of instances when community radio stations in the region delivered exemplary service to its listening communities, especially during natural disasters and other kinds of crisis situations. And today, we are meeting in the shadow of another major disaster, a public health crisis caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, and to learn about the role of community radios in the region during this period and beyond. And to help us steer this conversation, we have my good friend Ashish Sen, the former president of Amarc Asia Pacific, and a key figure in community radio advocacy, not only in India and South Asia, but elsewhere in a region that Amarc identifies as the Asia Pacific. His role in the community radio movement in India through the organization in Bangalore called Voices that he headed is too well known for me to repeat here. Some of the groundbreaking citizens media initiatives of Voices became the building blocks for the community radio movement in India. The 1996 Bangalore Declaration and the 2000 Pastapur initiative that announced the strong civil society aspiration for community radio in India were both outcomes of Ashish's untiring intellectual and activist efforts. Ashish has been intimately associated with the founding of the Community Radio Forum of India, a group that had played a critical role in campaigning for the opening of airwaves in India in the early 2000s. Ashish, as some of you may know, is also an avid theatre practitioner and author. And on behalf of the UNESCO Chair on Community Media, I'm indeed proud to have his generous contribution to our dissemination activities as the co-editor of our publication CR News, which is now entirely online. With those words, Ashish, may I now request you to engage with our distinguished panelists and take this dialogue forward, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Vinod, for your very generous and very kind introduction. And I just hope I live up to it. I'm delighted to be over here. And thank you in particular for giving us that very, very inspirational blast from the past when you recalled the contribution of Louis Tabin. And as you were speaking, I recalled his visit to India during a workshop in Chennai, I think it was in 2004, when he shared some words of wisdom which have always stayed with me. And he said that, you know, in these challenging times, when we think of participation and ownership, can we ever really imagine that community radio will live up to it, or will it always be considered to be too idealistic? And today, as we struggle with the pandemic crisis, I think those words seem to resonate. Perhaps community radio is too idealistic. Perhaps it is an ideal which is too ambitious to achieve and realize in its fullest sense. But even so, it is an ideal, I think, which is well worth aspiring towards. So thank you once again, Vinod, and a very, very warm welcome to all our panelists and to all of you who have taken time off your very busy schedules to be with us today. Before we start, just a few ground rules by way of reiteration. May I request our panelists keep their audio unmuted and to also have your videos on? I mean, that way, should any of you wish to also add to a point raised by someone else, you will be able to do so. I just request you to raise your hand so we know that you wish to say something. Thank you. The discussions this morning, afternoon, evening, or night, depending on wherever you are, promise to be truly interesting. Southeast Asia and the Pacific, as we know, is in many ways more than a region, not just because of its size, it's vast, or the diverse cultures, but also because of its diverse community radio histories and trajectories. The legislations and technologies in different countries are quite different over here. So I think we can look forward to a very, very promising and interesting discussion. So what has been exactly the impact of COVID-19 and the pandemic in these countries which we are about to go into? How has community been able to combat this pandemic? What do these experiences of these community radio stations in different parts of the Asia Pacific imply in Southeast Asia and in the Pacific, imply of shaping the texture of community radio in the post-pandemic period? These are just some of the challenges and some of the questions that we will be taking up in today's discussions. The discussions will be broadly divided into two parts. In the first part, I will request our panelists to share the context of COVID-19 and community radio in their country and what has been happening. And then from there, we will look at the discussions, the challenges which confront community radio and the larger issues. We have a very distinguished panel with us, and it is my pleasure to say a few words about them by way of an introduction. Start by taking you all the way down to the Pacific, to Suva and Fiji, and to introduce you to Sharon Bhagwan. The founder of FemLinkPacific in 2000, which many of us, if not all of us, know has done pioneering work in community broadcasting. Sharon is currently the technical advisor of Shifting the Power Coalition, which supports coordination of activities across 6 Pacific countries. A strong advocate of peace, gender, and worked extensively in the intersection between these areas and accessible media like community radio. In 2005, she was included in the 1,000 Peace Women for the Nobel Peace Prize. She is currently the co-chair of the Global Fund for Women and a Pacific board member of the World Association of Christian Communication. So a very warm welcome, Sharon.
Thank you, Ashish. Thank you.
Welcome. And now from the Pacific, we shift all the way to Yogyakarta, Indonesia, to Imam Prakoso, who has more than 25 years of experience working in the development sector, straddling a range of very impressive work, both as an urban economist and a media person. Along with other colleagues, Imam founded the Combined Resource Institution in the first of the 2000s to focus on managing community-based information networks and systems. He has done extensive work in the area, particularly of community radio and disaster mitigation and disaster preparedness, not just in Indonesia, but across the Southeast Asian region. This work goes all the way back to the 2004 tsunami in the Aceh region, and this has continued unabated all the way till today. So welcome, Imam. Imam,
thank you, Ashish.
Great.
Thank you.
Lovely. And now from Indonesia to Bangkok, Thailand, a very warm welcome to Supinya Klangnarong. Supinya is very well known for her work in both community radio and freedom of information and expression. She is currently the Deputy President of Amarc Asia Pacific and is also the co-founder of cofact.org, fact-checking communities in Thailand, and the co-founder of Digital Thinkers Forum, a Bangkok-based think tank on digital rights. She is an honorary member of the Ethics Committee of the National Press Council of Thailand and was former commissioner of the National Broadcast and Telecommunication Commission, NBTC, in Thailand between 2011 and 2017. Welcome, Supinya.
Thank you, Ashish. Hello, warm greetings to everyone from Bangkok.
Great. And we then move on to the Philippines, to Raymond Villanueva, who is another community broadcaster who has done seminal work in community media and freedom of expression. Welcome, Ray. He is currently director for radio in Kodao Productions, which is a well-known media production house in the country. Raymond is also affiliated with the National Union of Journalists of the Philippines, the Alliance of Community Media in Southeast Asia, of which he is a regional council member, and is also a founding member of the People's Alternative Network in the Philippines. He is the recipient of several awards for excellence in journalism, and also the author of several publications, including those that underline the importance of community voice and peace. Very warm welcome, Raymond. Thank you for being with us today. We go back to the Pacific Rim, to be exact, Kyoto in Japan. Katsuya Soda is very well known for his contributions and productions in community radio, especially those which focus on the voices of the excluded. He has done very, very pathfinding work and made many productions on migrant workers and created a very popular community FM radio program, Nanmin, which means refugee, now. Nanmin Now is a popular program on the Kyoto Sanjo radio, which started all the way back in 2004 to create awareness on refugee issues. Soda-san is also a member of JFUN, the Japanese Forum for the United Nations Refugee Agency, and is currently Lecturer of Community-Based Media and Multicultural Symbiosis at Doshisha University. A very warm welcome to you, Soda-san.
Thank you very much for inviting such a significant event. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And so, panelists and friends, without any further delay, let us start. And my first question, which is to all the panelists, but I'd like to begin by asking Sharon and Imam to first share their insights into how the COVID pandemic has impacted the functioning of community radio or community media in your country. First share their insights. Is it different? How so? Can we begin with Sharon, please?
Thanks, Ashish. Well, I'm going to take a regional perspective because I think it's really important to recognize that the Pacific Island region, when we talk about reaching the unreached, actually requires information communication systems that span across our blue Pacific. And currently I'm working with a number of civil societies organizations, both through Shifting the Power Coalition as well as the Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict. And this is where we're seeing the innovative approaches to reaching the most marginalized and vulnerable. As an example, Papua New Guinea at the moment, which is reporting a peak in COVID-19 cases, but it is a country with over 800 local languages. We have a young woman focal point based in Port Moresby who talks about the need to reach more Pacific women through talkback radio shows, panel discussions, information awareness raising, and just creating an awareness or creating a culture of community media so that more local women can get involved and participate in the conversation, not just about prevention, but obviously the longer term impact. In the same country, Papua New Guinea, but a 2-hour plane ride from Port Moresby, where Helena is based, lives Natasha. She lives on an island called Nissan, which is actually 85 kilometers from the main center for the autonomous region of Bougainville. For her, she says people actually risk their lives just to travel to the main center. And unfortunately, because of this distance, because of the ocean, they don't actually have access to information communication systems. So what we've been trying to do as GPAC and Shifting the Power Coalition is to actually look at the nexus of peace development and humanitarian reality. Because in addition to COVID-19, we had another major Category 5 storm that hit 4 Pacific Island countries in March, and that was Tropical Cyclone Harold. But through crises, I believe, comes innovation. We've seen in Vanuatu, where I've been able to work with women from the Women Who Talk Together network to adapt the Women's Weather Watch system, so that even before TC Harold, with COVID-19, they reached 77,000 people through SMS in their own local language to get information out there. And they're, of course, using radio, which is mostly public radio, to get information out. They were also able to adapt Women's Weather Watch to obviously prepare for the cyclone. I think what's also interesting is the diversity of civil society. So we have the Pacific Conference of Churches as well, which is using communication by way of developing sermons and guides to faith leaders to be able to ensure that they're not just getting the message out of prevention, but actually more deeply the prevention of violence and helping communities cope. In Tonga, the Talitha project that works mostly with young girls, they're actually also using public radio, but we're starting to see through these relationships how public radio is also starting to open up the airwaves so that you now have young people, young girls who are the most vulnerable and whose lives have been disrupted because of the closure of schools, able to talk about the issues that are most affecting them. And in Fiji, through a series of emergency grants, we've seen some really interesting innovation in terms of communicating with rural and remote women through Transcend Oceania that actually said, look, we've actually got to give these women credit on their phones so that they can talk to us, they can provide information. While FemLinkPacific, which I started back in 2000 and left in 2018, what they've done with these COVID-19 emergency grants is actually now working to ensure more younger women are going to be equipped with mobile phones to talk about the issues that are happening in their communities. What this is showing us, in particularly in the period of March to June, where we had the onset of COVID-19 and Tropical Cyclone Harold, particularly when we also work with women with disabilities in rural and remote islands, but also in the main centers, is the need for information to be made available through accessible platforms, accessible public and community platforms in local languages, with a focus on persons with disabilities, and focusing on how do we get the information out to communities that are off the grid, so to speak, off the information communication grid, but contributing in a way that we're talking, that they're able to feel more secure with the knowledge and to be equipped with an understanding of how to help them develop coping mechanisms if we are talking about building resilience. So I hope that today our conversation may lead us into thinking about how do we make community radio and community media more appropriate in this current time with the current challenges that we're facing. Thanks, Ashish.
Thank you, Sharon. Thanks. You've touched upon a huge range of issues, underlining the importance of community radio today. And from peace, humanitarianism, to reaching the marginalized, to actually look, you've underscored the importance of access to information, especially those who are excluded. Imam,
Yep.
I'd share your insights, please.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Ashish. I would like to explain first about the Indonesian situations related with COVID-19. Yeah, I think we almost all countries in the world affected by the pandemic COVID-19, including Indonesia. Indonesia is one of the countries that also experience with the pandemic now, but slightly different from other countries, including countries in South Asia like Philippines, Singapore, or Malaysia. The first positive COVID-19 that occurred in Indonesia was discovered in early of March, while at the time the other countries, like I mentioned before, is already have around more than 100 positive patients. So Indonesia is like other countries also is stuttering in handling these situations. Unfortunately, the government of Indonesia didn't respond seriously enough. In the late January and early February, when many neighboring countries, including mainland China, were confronted with a significant increase in the number of positive patients and the expansion of the affected area, Indonesian government instead said that the virus was unlikely to enter Indonesia. That's a bad situation at the time of Indonesia. Now, several neighboring countries, including Singapore, Malaysia, and Philippines, are entering the second wave of the pandemic. In Indonesia, is still in position to continue to increase. Last month, the increase of the patients daily is about 300 patients, but the end of July until August, it become 1,900 until 2,000 people who get positive COVID. So we don't know when it's happened. Like the other neighboring countries already moved down the slope, and then second wave coming. But in Indonesia, is still higher. It's affected with not only about the health, but of course the economic situations. In the other hand, the mainstream media continues to bombard the informations about the number of positive patients, the number of patients who died, the number of patients who were declared cured, including the loss of medical personnel in various hospitals due to positive COVID. The campaign to comply with the health protocol continues to be voiced at all the time by the government through various media. including through text message on each devices. Social media does the same thing, and even deception spread everywhere. The community responded to the development of the pandemic situation and handled it from their perspective. But one thing can be concluded, they generally do not understand exactly how the spread of the virus occurs. And the process of person is determined as a positive patient of COVID-19. Until now, ignorance the above situation of often cited as one reason the number of positive patients has increased dramatically, especially when the large number of local transmission have been found. Yeah, of course, it's a poor situation in Indonesia. And what happened with community radios? You know that Ashish already mentioned that we have a lot of experience in disaster reduction during the disaster situations. Of course, what happened in community radio. In Indonesia, community radio play a sufficient role in natural disaster situations. From 2004 Aceh tsunami to the 2018 earthquake and tsunami, also liquefaction in Central Sulawesi province. Community radio has played an essential role in emergency response operations and as well as disaster risk reductions. When the natural disasters such as volcanic, earthquake occur, community radio activists came to establish emergency radio or make the existing community radio function as an emergency radio. The practices of broadcasting by prioritizing the involvement of local communities and also survivors to voice their needs and bridge communication between aid providers and survivors is a mission in emergency response operations carried out by community radio. Disaster risk reduction campaign in disaster-prone area through community radio are considered more effective because of their local nature and with a message that they are easy to understand. The practices of several community radio stations around, for example, Mount Merapi, is one success story of DRR campaign through community radio. Not only that, now several disaster management agencies at the local level have included community radio in the district contingency plan documents. The trust in the role of community radio by the local government is increasing now. But this time is a very different. All regions in the countries experience the same emergency situations. Nobody was ready for that, including the broadcaster at the community radio. For almost a month, they stopped broadcasting because the social distancing policy had to be implemented. I believe all community radio activists didn't understand anything about the COVID at the time. Mm-hmm. After JRK took the initiative to encourage community radio to broadcast about the dangers of COVID-19 and its preventions, then the community radio quickly move to seek information about it. Another way is to invite parties such as a doctor from the community health centers to make a publications, campaign through community radio, even local police, because governments mobilize police to campaign how to avoid the COVID and how its preventions. JRKI also collaborates with Amarc Asia Pacific to provide information about COVID-19 and its preventions. Currently, around more than 100 community radio have regular broadcasts about COVID, including PSN and Talk Live. 100 community radio is around 25% from total community radio operating in Indonesia. The broadcast process is easy to observe because most of them share on their Facebook page. Some of live broadcasts are even broadcast via their Facebook page. There is an interesting situation that currently happening at the slope of Mount Merapi, which has a terrible eruption 10 years ago, is now starting to show an increase of the symptom of eruptions. At the same time, all parties are facing the COVID-19 pandemic. 3 community radios in the slope of Merapi are currently involved in preparing for 2 separate emergency events. One is how to avoid the pandemic. That means that a lot of people should be have a distance from one to others. But the another side, they have to help local government to campaign about the situations of starting to Merapi to erupt. So it's mean that governments, local governments, and also others stakeholders should bring the survivors go in one barrack. But in another side, it's dangerous if we put it all the peoples in the barracks because there is no social distancing. That's another situation. I think it's not also happened in Merapi in Java Island in near Yogyakarta, but it also happened in other situations. Like for example, last 2 weeks in one of the Sulawesi part in Sulawesi Islands also have big floods, and many local government staff confused how to solve the situations because at the same time they get they get instruction from the leaderships for social distancing policy, but in another side, how can they bring all the people go to the safe area? It means that it should be collected. So the situation is like that. Also happen in the surround community radios. But yeah, of course, we cannot do anything that just continues the campaign. Another thing, yeah.
Maybe
okay,
we'll come.
I stop that.
No, yeah, I think you've given us a lot of food for thought to chew on over here, but I think you've also underlined a huge amount of very, very important issues, which we'll come back to: accurate information, trust building, and what do you do in a situation which is very much like a catch-22 situation. On the one hand, you have to bring people, communities to safe harbors during times of disaster. On the other hand, a pandemic like COVID-19 warrants the need for social distancing. So how do you reckon with that? Thank you for sharing these challenges with us, Imam. I'd like to now move on, and we'll come back to addressing some of those in more detail shortly. But if we could move on to Thailand and then to the Philippines, if you could share with us your insights, Supinya and Raymond, on how the COVID pandemic has impacted community radio in your countries. Supinya? We can't hear you, Supinya.
Okay.
Audio? Yeah,
yes,
perfect.
I already unmuted. Thank Ashish and to everyone and to all fellows and colleagues. Yes, greeting from Thailand. We have rather good news in terms of COVID situation. It looks like it's under control because we don't have a domestic infection for around 2 months. So far, only people who came back from abroad and stay in state quarantine that monitor and then a few cases every day. But in general, the situation is rather okay because of the tough measure of the government. We have around our total number 3,300 of people who infected, around 50 people dead. But so far, but we still apply social distancing, and foreigners still are not allowed to come to our country except they are under state quarantine. So I would say that Thailand rather doing well in handling the pandemic situation, that because of the collaboration of people of all sectors, especially the decentralized mechanism in managing information, and community media and community radio play a part on that because of one of the key sector that help spreading the correct information to the community are the health volunteer. We call health volunteer for community, and many of them also broadcasting or using local and community radio, spreading the announcement of the news from the government. At the beginning of the pandemic, around March, there has been a confusion of the information. We call it information disorder because government also confused us, and we were under a panic situation. But after that, after the information being decentralized, each governor and each province, they have their own announcement, and local media, including community media, also playing a role to reach the people in local area, speaking in their own language, especially in some area like the deep south of Thailand, where most of the majority are Muslim, and they need to be informed via their own language, via their own, storytelling. So if we have only national media broadcasting or telling from the government or centralized, those messages will not go out to the people in local area, which have diversity from ranking of culture and languages and belief and everything, and trust issue. They need to be informed via their own language from people they trust. So that's why in this pandemic era, community media and community radio and local media now became significant after they being maybe pay less attention because everyone keep talking about social media, Facebook and Twitter, and it's correct. Facebook and Twitter still play a very significant role in creating debate in Thailand, but sometimes there are a lot of misinformation, disinformation, fake information. So for people to really verify fact and figures and what they should be known, so they rely on community media, which speaking in their own languages and connected to their culture, and they trust the people who speaking. So in general, briefly, I would say that this is the role of the community radio. But before I end this, I would like to give you a little of the figures, because Thailand rather popular when we're talking about legalized community radio, because 10 years ago we have almost 10,000, but after gone through the legalization process under the NBTC, which is the regulator, most of the unlicensed community radio and local radio became licensed, but somehow they gone through difficult process of legalization. So up to now there are legitimate number around 5,730 station, but now only 4,142 that allowed to be broadcast. Around 1,500 radio stations in Thailand are restricted because maybe they're still not following the rules. And among 3,142 stations that allowed to broadcast, we call it in general as a local radio, but it divided into three categories, which are public service, local radio. We have 672 now, and the commercial one, the biggest one, we have 3,286, and the community radio from 500 in the past few years, now only 184 stations left that allowed to be broadcast. So I would say that what I want to say that now we need community media more than ever during the pandemic, but we have less and fewer the station because of the many obstacles, funding, sustainability, or whatever. So in a nutshell, from in the past 10 years, the number are less, but some of them still active, and they still play a very important role during the pandemic in Thailand. Thank you.
Thank you, Supinya, for that. And thank you for making that very, very important clarification of disaggregating the numbers of radios in the country, public service, local and community, so that you give us a true, accurate picture. And in that sense, the need for community radios, real community radios, to have a level playing field in Thailand, if they really are able to realize their maxim. Thank you for sharing those figures, and we'll come back to you later to ask you a little bit more about that. But meanwhile, over to Raymond to share his thoughts on the context, please.
Thank you, Ashish. Good afternoon from Manila, Philippines. which is under another lockdown because of the virus. It is definitely different here in the Philippines because of the kind of response that the government has adopted, with new cases of between 3 to 6,000 daily, and with the total number of cases breaching 117,000 as we speak. The Philippine government is looking like it is losing the battle with the virus. Instead of listening to the medical community, Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte, in his latest public address, has scolded the medical community for airing their demands. The president initially dismissed the warnings early on and refused to ban Chinese tourists and online gaming workers from entering the country. True enough, the first COVID-19 cases in the Philippines were from these groups. Equally grievous was his decision to put retired generals in charge of the country's pandemic response, which has resulted in a militaristic approach, such as militarization of communities, beatings, arrests, sex for passes, killings, on top of woefully inadequate assistance to millions of workers who both temporarily and permanently were forced out of their jobs by the pandemic. And so while this pandemic rages across the country, democratic spaces are being constricted. It has become more difficult to operate freely as independent media outfits and as community broadcasters. At the start of the lockdown, the government regulated those who could go out on coverage, only giving quarantine passes to those who work for private media companies and government entities. So it has become more difficult for community broadcasters and independent journalists to practice freedom of expression. And there have been several arrests of people who were suspected of being too critical of the government, which is, of course, undermining the right to freedom of expression. So that's the situation in the Philippines.
Thank you, Raymond. That is very, very worrying. You raised another very, very important point: the interlinkage between community broadcasting and freedom of expression. We're actually seeing growing in various parts of the world, something that indeed is very, very worrying. We'll come back to this in a short while. But now over to Soda-san to share his thoughts with us about the community radio context, about the community radio situation in the context of the pandemic. Soda-san.
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, please permit me to share one thing.
Yes.
Today, August 6th is one of the significant days for us. 75 years ago, the atomic bomb hit Hiroshima, Japan. So August 6th is we think about the peace. So such a significant day. I really appreciate joining such a significant event. Thank you very much.
Thank you for sharing that with us, Soda-san.
And I would like to share the COVID-19 situation in Japan and the role of community radio. I would like to explain briefly. Unfortunately, we are in the middle of the pandemic. February to May, we experienced the first attack of COVID-19. And the end of May, national government removed declaration of state of emergency due to decrease the number of the infected persons. But since last month, the number of the infection restarted to increase. And recently, there are over 1,000 infected persons a day continuously. It shows we are facing a second attack, obviously. So now total confirmed are about over 42,000, and the total deaths persons are about 1,000. And I would like to share the greatest features of Japan. If someone infected in Japan, many people criticize to infected person and blame it is your self-responsibility. Sometimes people try to upload the name or picture of infected persons on internet. It means intolerance is one of the features of Japan, I think. And what did the change and what did not change about the community radio? I interviewed some community radio stations. Many people emphasized that open the studios. This is a very important keyword for us. They emphasize they keep on opening studio is the biggest challenge for them, because they try to open the studio as usual, such a difficult situation, because they know information and the voices of the local community is one of the basic human needs. So they still keep on opening the studio. This is what is not changed. Mm-hmm. And the second one, what did change? People cannot come to studio, obviously, such kind of situations. So this situation, but on the other hand, this situation accelerated to mixed medias, especially internet and radio. For example, interviewed, report, or sending materials from my house to studios. This is what it changed positive aspect. And the third one is connecting people more strongly. I think this is a changing aspect. I would like to introduce a good example. In Tokyo, community radio named FM Higashi Kurume made a program. This is a school, elementary school's principal appeared a program and made cheer up messages to students. They made programs 1 month straight. And usually the relationship the teachers and the students are teaching something and learning something. But under the COVID-19 situation, changed these relationships positively. They gathered together and they support each other. This is also what is changed. And now I would like to add one more thing. This present situation remained me. The 2011 tsunami hit the Japan, and the incident of nuclear power plant happened. At the time, community radio or emergency radio needed to avoid to talk about radioactive contamination, because if they talk about radioactive contamination, it's become a seed of the conflict. So they needed to try to avoid to talk about the theme of the radioactive contamination in 2011. And now some community radios seemed to try to avoid the agenda setting about COVID-19. They relatively they focus to the how we protect our lives, economic aspect. I think they are more focused. This is now recent situations in Japan and community role of community media. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Soda-san. Lives versus livelihood. Again, that is a debate that is raging across the world. And it's not just a challenge for community media, it's a cross media. How do we address it? I think, despite the various divergences that have emerged in our discussions, I'd like to thank all the panelists, because underlying that, you raised some very, very important key issues, and I'd like to focus on some of them. One of the things that you have all mentioned is it's not just about community radio per se, but you've drawn linkages between community radio, not just health, but community radio and the marginalized, community radio and policy reform, community radio and peace. And we'll be looking at some of these challenges right now and what needs to be done in the context of creating a more enabling climate for community radio. Soda-san, I'd like to pick up a point that you raised and take off on that level. You talked about the changes that we are seeing in community radio production. So the way programs are being produced, you talked about studios being open, but people not coming to studios, so how they were making programs. So I'd like to take that forward now and look at technology and what we are seeing. You also talked and touched upon mixed media. But before I ask you, let me ask Sharon, because Sharon, you've done seminal work, particularly with technologies, looking at suitcase radio and mobile broadcasting in the past, ever since the 2000s through FemLink. Now, clearly that has changed. But again, what changes are we seeing because of the COVID pandemic in the way that community broadcasting is taking place?
Well, I think definitely there is the opportunity to be making more local content. We, through the Shifting the Power Coalition at the moment, we have 9 focal points across 6 Pacific Island countries, including 2 women with disabilities. And so the first thing that we've made sure that they have is obviously that, you know, they need to be equipped with a smartphone, but that they also have the resources to communicate with women in their communities. And then also obviously data, which is so expensive. You can produce content, but then how do you transfer? How do you share content? So that's been really important. And I think this is where we can start to look at my earlier point about how do we go beyond the limitations of the broadcast spectrum. Clearly, there are opportunities where we can further democratize the broadcast spectrum, even if it means that as broadcasters, we don't necessarily have to have the infrastructure, but having access to the airwaves. How can public service broadcasters, how can government ensure that there is an allocation on the spectrum for what Supinya mentioned earlier, these local radio stations? But it comes back to content, because you can have the airwaves, but if you're not producing content, what does that mean? So for us, it's about creating content and content that is being supported in a way that women, within the limitations of COVID-19, we've been able to see that we can gather, we can document, and we can communicate. We recently used a simple WhatsApp technology to get women from across the Pacific Island countries to share, to produce a public service announcement that is talking about, you know, why we work together as a coalition at this time. We are using mobile phones, obviously, to record what communities are saying. And it's been interesting to learn and teach remotely as well. So I think there are these opportunities now to use the telephone, to use mobile phones. But I want us to sort of come back to a little bit about where we were maybe in the earlier days of community broadcasting and start to think about community radio clubs. You know, should we go back to producing content and distributing on CDs so that people can sit down at home in their community and receive information? Maybe we can be producing dramas that can be going out on DVDs, because the issue is getting the facts. Yes, that's really important. Staying on top of the social economic developments. Yes, that's important. But also that space to actually process the information, to really understand and be part of the discourse. So I think it's about, you know, challenging the status quo in terms of the democratization. It's about having that safe space to create content and be innovative. I think that the issue here is innovation. And a lot of it, Ashish, comes down to resourcing as well. So what are the resources that are not just about, you know, here's a project about COVID, but actually here's a project about human security that is about people's health, people's community security, economic security, etc. Yeah.
Thank you. I think that's a very, very important point that you raised over there. We need to actually strengthen these strands and see what these horizontal linkages are between, say, community media, community broadcasting, and these larger themes of peace and humanitarianism and gender and marginalization. But to continue with the technology factor, what you're saying is very, very interesting too, because you're not just talking about digitalization, but you're doing a combination of technologies of doing offline broadcasting as well, and mixing the two in that sense when you talked about productions on CD-ROMs. But it also raises another issue of access. And I think that's something that we need to look at. If we could ask maybe Soda-san, coming back to you when you talked of the mixed media model, because there is the challenge of digitalization which the sector is facing. How has the challenge of digitalization affected community broadcasting in terms of access in Japan, for instance, Soda-san? Would you like to share your thoughts?
Thank you very much. In Japan, the digitalization are now in a university very accelerate to use the internet to the remote online educations. And even in also in the community radio, many stations use the internet to the interview program or report something, the report for the remote areas. And it's obviously it is a very useful or helpful tools for the community radios. But on the other hand, I would like to say that emphasize that senior citizens is hard to access the online medias. So I think for the especially for the senior citizens need to very easier to access through the community radios. So I think only one. I think the digitalization is very
yes, important.
Yeah, very important for us. But on the other hand, we need to take care of the such kind of persons, especially for example senior citizens. On the I would like to share the FMYY now started community garden. They try to growing the vegetables, and they obviously take care of the social distance, but they try to provide such kind of activities through the community radios. So I think digitalization is very important, but we need to remain such kind of activities for access to many people. So this is my opinion and the Japan in the situation in Japan. Okay.
Thank you for that. Raymond, let me put the same question to you. Do you find that digitalization has impacted community broadcasting, terrestrial broadcasting in your country? Community broadcasting? Your audio is, please unmute yourself. Please unmute.
All right. Okay. First, let me say that I agree with some of the points that were raised by Katsuya-san. Digitalization is very important, and it's with us now. I foresee that the Philippines would have to eventually go the way of digitalization. As a huge church-owned radio service based in the Philippines has recently gone down too. But in a country that has the second worst internet service in the region, and on which the population, majority of which are very poor, have to pay for internet connection, this will have to take a long while yet. Analog community broadcasting is still the way to go. Currently in the Philippines, more so that we are an archipelagic country composed of more than 7,100 islands. And many of the major and big islands that are populated have very huge mountainous areas that only analog broadcasting would be able to fully service at this point. So definitely digitalization is the way to go. It's just very difficult in the Philippines because of the kind of internet service that we have and the kind of topography that the Philippines has. It would have to be a combination at this point. Definitely, when we conduct trainings for setting up community radio stations, digitalization is part of the curriculum and the training process. But in order to reach the marginalized communities, which we aim to serve here in the Philippines, then it would have to be a combination of both old and new technology.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that. From challenge of digitalization, let's move on to trust building, another point that was raised by some of our panelists earlier. I think, Imam, you raised this point that Indonesia's initial response was that the government was stuttering as far as addressing the pandemic was concerned, but now there is a greater importance given to community radio in the context of local information. Now, for that trust which they are showcasing, it also needs to be nurtured. Do we find that just as much as that there is an increased recognition of the importance given to community radio, are there any support mechanisms being given by the state to enable community radios and the sector to sustain themselves? Would you share your thoughts? Please unmute.
Okay. Yes. Thank you, Ashish. Yeah. Before it, I want to explain about one case, interesting case in Indonesia during the pandemics. Of course, we know that the use of internet is now one of the ways that is considered quite the most relevant during COVID pandemics. Most employees work from home, students from elementary schools to colleagues learn from home. Online sales have significantly increased since the epidemics took place. And all are using in the internet. Today, the internet is the basis of most people's activities. Of course, in Indonesia, government decided, the Ministry of Education decided to use the online teaching for elementary students until the campus. But, however, not everyone can access the internet. Besides that, there are still blank spot area in various regions in Indonesia, even in Java Island. Java Island is a center of Indonesians, but part of the island still is a blank spot, have a lot of blank spot areas. Of course, if we found that regions, for example, in Papua, there is a lot of blank spot. But besides that, also about the inability to access the internet due to economic capabilities. At the present, I think it's related with what Raymond's already mentioned. Some community radios are responding to this gap in accessing the internet by inviting schools to work together to provide regular school lessons through radio broadcasts. Now, at least 3 community radio stations already have collaborated with elementary schools and high schools to have lessons. They invite the teachers and develop curriculums, how to teach through radio station, through community radios. But after its operations, and then JRKI promoting how to community radio, bridging the learning process in the pandemic period through a series of webinars and also inviting many people to campaigns. Then a lot of schools, especially in Eastern Indonesia, interest to using community radio to be part of official learning process in the schools. Now at least another 5 we call emergency radio, because JRKI using this label as emergency radios to get the license from the Ministry of Communication and Informations. Now I think it is one success stories how community radio can have a big roles not only talking about how to campaign about the COVIDs, but how to bridging the gap of information that should be accessed by students because they don't get internet access.
Well,
so
thank you for that. Thank you for that. Thank you for actually, bringing that so clearly out, that how do we bridge the digital divide? But the question is, right, to get there, how do we also bridge the trust divide? And I think that's something that we also need to look at. So your experience has been the relationship between working with the governments and what can be done to strengthen that and therefore strengthen the sustainability of the sector.
I can share what the experience related with disaster risk reduction issues that already mentioned before. That based on our studying in Japan, that how community radio or how governments help community radio to operate during the emergency situations. That issues now bring to Indonesia, and we have several collaborations with local governments. And of course, not only one or two, but there is several local governments working together with community radio. To put community radio is one of the system in the contingency plan in the issue of disaster risk reductions. So not only put it in the contingency plans, but working closely when the disaster occurs.
Right.
Now that's one concrete examples that now it's become more and more. Not only one or two local government, but it's more than 3 or 5 other local governments, especially related with the disasters.
Thank you. I think getting access to that information would be very good learning and sharing for all of us, because we need to look at how we can forge closer collaborations to actually deepen and sustain the sector. Raymond, if I could come back to you, I mean, Imam has shared this in terms of an emergency response, but if you could share with us, how easy is it or how difficult is it to work with the government, and how do you reckon with censorship? We were recently reading about the kidnapping of a community radio journalist, and how do you address issues like this?
Well, currently, even before the pandemic, there has been a very difficult relationship between the independent and community media and the government. In fact, even during this pandemic, the government, led by the president himself, has caused the closure of the country's biggest broadcasting corporation. And then one very prominent newspaper editor was found guilty of cyber libel. And then one community broadcaster, of which who I personally trained while she was still in college, was refused to post bail. She was arrested last January of trumped-up charges. And just this March, one partner in the establishment of a community radio station was abducted. We're still looking for her. Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte, even before assuming office, has justified media killings. And then he has not made secret of his vindictiveness against critical media. I don't know if there is a point of collaboration between the independent media, mass media community in the Philippines and the Philippine government. Those who appear to be collaborating with the government is only doing it, is doing so because of fear from reprisals from a very vindictive president who uses the powers of his office and the entire machinery of the Philippine government to go after critical press. So what we're doing now is to assert, fight, and defend for freedom of expression and our very existence as broadcasters and journalists. We don't know who would come out victorious in the end, but we're very hopeful that he has just about 2 more years left to go. And that would be a very happy day to finally see the end of this current regime.
Thank you, Ray. On that very somber note, let me paraphrase this question somewhat and ask Supinya. Supinya, we have been talking about community radio in disaster situations, and Ray has also underlined the importance of freedom of expression and the threat of censorship in his country. And while there is good news that you've shared with us, there are a couple of conflict areas too. And you were talking about the South and community radio stations in the South over there when it comes to addressing issues of minorities and conflict situations. Could you share your experience in that context?
Yes, thank you. So before going to the South in general, after COVID, Thai government also declared emergency law as well. So that somehow has an impact on the self-censorship of the media, because the media and people have to be careful. Sometimes the government said that you should not spread misinformation, but it could prevent criticism against the government policy as well. So now the emergency decree is still going on, and people asking to lift that off, because now Thailand, we are under control, but it's continue that the extra power. So that also apply in the Deep South as well, because in the Deep South experience such extra special law for a long time. They are under emergency decree, they are under national security, so all rules are more restricted than the rest of the country, and their privacy or their right may be being more violated. For example, when you go to the Deep South or you live in the Deep South, you register for mobile phone, you have to show your biometric, so different standard apply in Bangkok. So people protest against that, and some they don't want to do that, and so that's why they lost signal. They could not use mobile phone. So that's strange tensions going on in the Deep South area. And NBTC, my previous office, the one who applied that law, you are not allowed to be connected if you are not allowed the operator to scan your face or doing a biometric registration. That's one of the strong tension going on for a long time, and especially when it happened during the pandemic, it's even more difficult for them because they need to be connected, but they also don't want to be under that kind of regulation. But what about the rest of the media? Of course, I think they've been under a strong special law for a long time, so censorship applied. But somehow, local media, they try to be the voice of the voiceless, because you know that after the lockdown, Thai national who are Muslim, who work in Malaysia, they want to cross the border back to home in Thailand, but it's very difficult to them to come back because of the strong measure applied by the government and the kind of misunderstanding or double standard, this and that. And people in the Deep South area, they want to shout, to cry out for more understanding. And I think the local media and community radio try to be the voice of the voiceless for that regards as well. But somehow, unfortunately, they're captured by the national media a lot, but not a lot, but when the time it was published in the national media, it when the government showed the figures of the infection rate, and it happened to be that day that the number increased because of the Thai Muslim community coming back from other countries, and they put in headline to represent the identity of the Muslim community in the South. So it sort of create like stigmatized, or it could lead to a sort of misunderstanding or hate speech. So there's a complaint from the NGO, civil society who work in the Deep South area about the media ethic in portraying that. While the local media, community media, of course, they try to be the voice of the voiceless, and they try to represent the voice of the Muslim and the Thai Muslim who want to go back home, crossing the border from Malaysia. But the national media, maybe they capture in other aspect. So that briefly, I could give you an example of the issue going on in the past few months.
Thank you. Thank you. I think in that you've also touched upon a very important point, the point of media ethics during times of disaster and during times of COVID, and what we need to do and what we perhaps should consider doing in the community broadcasting sector. But you also talked about how community radio has been trying to aspire towards really being the voice of the voiceless. And in that context, I'd just like to jump all the way to Japan and Soda-san, and then to Sharon, both who work with marginalized communities. Soda-san, you've done a lot of work with migrant workers and migrant laborers. And can you share with us what your experience over here in terms of the role of community radio in addressing the voices of minority groups and marginalized groups like the migrant workers? What's it been like?
Thank you very much. I'm making the broadcast radio program about refugee issues, like you mentioned. And I'm always working with Myanmar people in Japan. And in Japan, almost 30,000 people live in Japan, and many big community located in Tokyo. And I go to Tokyo and I always work with them. And 80% of them are working with restaurants and hotels industries. And after the COVID-19 impact, mostly people lost their jobs. And even my friends, even some of my friends lost the houses, and they unfortunately they spend as homeless now. And in Japan, sometimes criticized very, severe behavior against foreign migrant workers or refugees. And the COVID-19 situation accelerate to such kind of behavior, especially against foreign migrant workers. And civil society started to support them, and some CSO tried to raise the fund, and over one CSO raised over $200,000 US in 2 months. I think this is a big amount of the fund. But on the other hand, it is still voluntary work of civil societies. So I think we need to linkage such kind of activities to the public support of the local government or national government. Mm-hmm. So I think the community radio have the possibility to play a role to connect between the local voices to the local government or national government. So now we just start a program, Foreigners or Migrant Workers' Lives Matter. This is the name of the campaigns. Mostly, but unfortunately, mostly people are indifferent about the situation of the migrant workers. So in the community level, we will start to inform the situation of the migrant workers or refugees and inform their voices to the community. This is now we are planning. This is the context.
Thank you, Soda-san. Thank you. I think you've also addressed the issue of deepening linkages with government, both at national and local level, while you've answered this question. Sharon, your thoughts in this regard about community broadcasting addressing issues of people with disabilities and other minority groups with whom you've been working during these times?
Well, one of the good things that has come about, and I think this is where, as those working in community media and independent media and community radio, we really need to see ourselves as part of the bigger social movement, the bigger civil society movement. We're there to be working in unison, and also how do we also utilize the human rights treaties and conventions that our countries, our governments have subscribed to. So in the context of the rights of persons with disability, it has been people with disability who have really championed and brought about the International Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability. So for us, as the Shifting the Power Coalition, when the coalition was formed back in 2016, we thought it was vitally critical, because where we were coming from of our experience of the climate crisis and of gender inequalities, we know that women with disabilities, persons with disabilities, face a double burden of discrimination because they just don't have access to information, and quite often they're treated as poor victims rather than a person with the capacity and the ability to make decisions for themselves. So it has been vitally important for a number of years in my own work to ensure that women with disabilities are given the space on radio, given the space on the media, to be able to talk, to sign, to communicate their issues. And so what we're seeing in the public media now, particularly in national television, is that there's a lot more sign interpretation, which is great, but obviously we still have to figure out how do we get better at making information accessible for persons who are hearing impaired, for persons who are more visually impaired as well. And also learning that it's not just about physical disability, it's also about psychosocial disability. And I think the whole issue of mental health as well in this current context, where you're being given a double whammy, if you want, in terms of having a disability, or even with people who are just feeling so isolated and just completely lost because they've been, your community's just recovering after a cyclone 2 years ago and you're hit by another one. You suddenly got COVID-19 in your Pacific Island country and the borders have shut down. We're predominantly economies that rely on tourism. What does that mean in terms of your livelihood? How do you even provide, beyond the lockdowns, etc.? So I think it is about access. It is about making our media and communication systems accessible. It's also about us as producers thinking about how is this content going to look, going to sound like, how is it going to relate to somebody that's not heteronormative, able-bodied. And I think the point also, I just wanted to pick up on the point that Imam was talking about in terms of how you can collaborate when the environment is right, obviously the political environment is right, in times of disaster. I think in the current COVID situation as well, given there's this huge humanitarian system that gets operationalized, and we have one here in the Pacific, we also really need to make sure that the responses that our governments are developing, yes, this is about COVID and it's about improving health infrastructure and health systems, but information and communication cannot be sidelined. It can't just be treated as a public relations exercise or an assumption that when the Prime Minister or the Minister for Health is speaking, everybody is tuned in to the television or everybody is online. So how do we also make sure that those messages about what's happening, about nationhood, is filtering down to the community, but also community experiences are informing the response and recovery processes. It's been really difficult to even get gender equality and women's rights, and you know, the prevention of gender-based violence and protection issues into some of these bigger spaces when decisions are being made for our region. So I think that's also where we really need free and independent information communication that is influencing the kind of future that we want if we're talking about resilience of communities and diversity of peoples as well. Yeah.
Thank you, Sharon, for raising all those very, very critical points. I mean, the question is really, how do we address the issue of bringing equity into who speaks and who listens? And how is this to be done? I think 2 points that emerged from both Sharon and Soda-san's responses, which left sort of a lingering impression with me, was how do we actually deepen our engagement with civil society? How do we deepen our engagement between community radio and movements? I think we should look at these as not just challenges, but as opportunities. And on that note, I'd like us to consider, and I'd like to actually pose this question to Imam. What do we feel about the role of community radio networks in helping to broaden this? How effective is the role of community radio networks in strengthening and building and enabling community radio environment, a community media environment in our countries and regions? Imam, perhaps you could share with us some thoughts on how GRKI, the Community Radio Association in Indonesia, is going about doing this.
Yeah, thank you, Ashish. Yeah, of course. Maybe it's I don't know. It's only happen in Indonesia, or it can be happen also in another country with a different environment. But one of the goals of GRKI is not only how to managing the membership, because GRKI is a membership organizations, but also how to share the knowledge and skills to as well as good practices from one radio to another radios. It is one for me is a key point of how, like for example, that I already mentioned, when we have good relations with Japan's several community radio in Japan, and we bring the experience that replicate here in Indonesia, then after that we can share to others regions. Part of other Indonesian regions, like for example in North Sumatra, in Central Sulawesi, and Lombok, and in Bali. Then many community radios can also have their own the idea how to deal with, like for example, with the local governments. What I'm talking about, I mentioned before about the good relationship with government is in the level of practical. Yeah, I agree with Sharon and other panelists that in the strategic level we still have a problem. Now, GRKI is still working with that, how to deal with governments, because we are know that what the relationship already developed with many sectors of local governments and the central government is not strong enough to say that the government has fully opened the presence of this third sector media. We still have homework, how to make it, for example, revising the broadcasting law that already starting since 10 years ago, but that's no progress until now. And back to the
Question?
Networking. Mm-hmm. Yes, of course. One the goals of GRKI, how to share the idea and give the examples or good practices to many community radios, then they can follow the good practice and replicate it once. And And the second one is how they serve, because community radio is a members, and JRKI can serve many things that related with the right of life of community radio. Like for examples, when I mentioned before that several schools needs to set up emergency radio to help students get teaching, not in online, but teaching process through community radios, through emergency radios. Then JRKI help them to facilitate to get the license, temporary license for our emergency radios. So I think these methods, and also opening the communication with all of parties, not only NGOs, but also governments and local governments, can make it the situation is better.
Thank you.
That's all. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Imam, for that. On that very, very positive note, I mean, thank you for also sharing the work of JRKI. But on that very, very positive note, you've given us lots of food for thought. But unfortunately, I'm reminded that, we're crossing time. So I'm afraid we'll have to now move on to the next part of the discussion which is the question and answer session. But I'd like to thank the panelists once again for a very, very engaging discussion. Thank you so very much. Over to you, Vinod, now for the question and answers. Thank you again.
Thanks, Ashish. Thanks to all the panelists. Very engaging discussion. I'm sure we can go on with the conversation among the panelists, but I think we also have other participants from other parts of the world who want to engage with you. As we wait for some questions to emerge, Ashish, is it okay if I kickstart with one question?
Of course.
Yeah.
Yes.
So this is a question particularly to, I think, perhaps Supinya and Raymond, where I think a certain kind of, in their comments, you could see that there is a certain tension between the government and civil society. I mean, it comes much more sharply, of course, in Raymond's comments on the political situation there, but also in Supinya's information that she shared with us about the declining number of community radio stations from what we all used to think were like 1,000 stations at one time. So I'm not too sure what's happening there. So I'm just wondering whether community radios, like in some countries, are better off staying in the somewhat safe domain of development, of agriculture, education, and so on. But the moment community radios engage with more contentious issues like freedom of expression, of democratic rights, and so on, do they then come under threat from the state? I mean, given this, what's the potential for survival of community radio in places like Thailand and in the Philippines?
So thank you for questions. Yes, it's an interesting development in Thailand because a decade, more than 2 decades ago, I think it was somehow people said that it's hype because there's too many stations here according to the constitution and according to the law. Compared to many countries, we have rather advanced legislation that guarantee the right to access the airwave and licensing of the community radio and etc. And even we have a media funding for community radio. But eventually in practice, it did not go ideally as people expected because one reason is about, of course, political issue because Thailand gone through up and down politically. We had military coup. twice in these 2 decades, and at the time, community radio play a lot of political expression. And after NBTC started to get them in order, so many of them are shut down. And of course, some of them were too aggressive in terms of, spreading hate speech and lies and whatever. But eventually, the government also cracking down the community radio, the political one as well. So a number reduced because of that reason. That's the first reason. And the second one, the issue of the sustainability, the funding issue. They're supposed to get funded by NBTC fund or core media fund, but in practice, I think it's only small amount that now being funding to some community radio. There's no sustainable model that they get funded from the funding that setting in the law that they should get money from commercial station and subsidize the community one. That's the concept we created in the law, but it's not happening in the reality. So they're struggling, and the model of self-sustainability also that did not last in most of the station, but the one that's still existing, they still continue that model, the very good and ideal one that they rely on the community contribution. That's very great. And the other, of course, the other reason similar to other countries like the digital disruption, radio became like a traditional media for many, so they jumped to social media completely. Even radio station now they also do multimedia. They broadcast via Facebook page, or they have a clip on YouTube, etc. And sometimes they communicate via chat application. So that's why people maybe rely on other source of media rather than community radio. So it became less popular in general. So that's why that's the reason. We have a good law, great mechanism, but in practice it's not fully function. So community radio complain a lot about that. That because of the internal conflict in Thailand up and down on political issue and the external factor like technology and digital disruption. Yeah.
Thanks, Supinya. Of course, Raymond was much more forthright in saying that there is no point in collaborating with the state. Raymond, you want to comment on my question?
Raymond, are you there? Sorry.
I think he's on mute. Yeah. He needs to
Alright.
unmute. Yeah.
Yes, Professor. What irony indeed that we started this forum with you giving credit to my compatriot Louis Tabing, who has engendered community radio broadcasting in our region. And yet, the Philippines now lags behind compared with other countries, especially with Indonesia in terms of community radio broadcasting. Well, let me say that whatever crazy things that you might have heard about our president, let me now confirm them and add that he is much worse with Filipinos. I believe it doesn't matter whether a radio station or a media entity merely focuses on development broadcasting. So long as we have a vindictive government and a crazy president, our very right to exercise broadcasting is in danger. For example, he went after the biggest broadcasting network in the Philippines, which is just for profit and does not really delve into development stories at all, as community radio stations are doing. So our situation is simply very different. Our situation is such that the time calls for us to stand up and hold the line, so to speak, before we could talk about doing other things like producing development broadcast materials. We must fight for the right to broadcast first. and exist as independent media practitioners. So far, under the current president, there have been 16 media practitioners who have been killed, majority of whom were broadcasters in the communities. That's just the situation in the Philippines. So, we don't want to. The Philippines has been under several political upheavals, and I'm personally tired going through such very tiring and dangerous times. But there are ideals and principles that we must stand up for as part of our service to our publics, as part of who we are as servants using broadcasting as our platform.
Thank you, Raymond. Kanchan, did you have a follow-up question to this? Or did you have a different question? Kanchan, are you there?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah. I was going to ask a similar question, basically, to Raymond, and if any of the other panelists would like to answer about, the relationship between the government and community radio. And like you've both said, it's not exactly an easy one, and there is likelihood of more restrictions than freedoms, if you get involved with the government. So what do you feel? I mean, there is no future there, or what do you think community media should do to redefine its engagement with the state in the post-pandemic world?
Are you addressing it to anyone in particular?
Yeah, Raymond, and maybe if Soda or Imam would like to answer. I have another question, but I'll ask that after this.
No.
Let me go first this time. Let me edit that a bit. We're looking at post Duterte situation, not just post pandemic. I don't think at this point we could see where the virus would cease to exist. We don't know whether that would happen. But I am personally hopeful, and we look forward to the end of the current administration, Philippine government, and with the next presidential elections would not come soon enough. And with that, we hope that our new leader would be more understanding, would have an understanding of what human rights is, what being benevolent to the governed means, as their responsibility to the people. That's my answer to that. We look forward more than to the end of this pandemic, but to the end of repression, and in which case we would be able to freely practice community broadcasting to serve our communities better.
Thank you. Soda-san, you want to comment on that? Yeah.
Unmute.
Thank you very much. Let me explain about the situation in Japan. In Japan, people want to establish the community radio. They can, anybody can establish the community radio under the law. But in 2010, the national government designated community radio to basement radio stations in the country. So it means community radio needs to big scale of the budget and rich facilities. And it is very difficult to keep on running the community radio, especially after that at the 2011 tsunami. When tsunami hit Japan, there were so many emergency radio started, and they really hoped to continue or keep on running as a community radio. But like I mentioned, on the budget aspect, financial aspect, and the facilities aspect, they needed to abandon. So the relationship between the community radio and the national government is not conflict or battle situations, but system or law is very has serious problems. I think there are serious problems, and I would like to put one thing. In Japan, the community radio's board members are only Japanese. They exclude the foreigners. So this is obviously discrimination or a violation of human rights, I think. So we need to change such kind of the systems. This is a mission of community radio's practitioners or researchers, I think.
Thank you. Esther, is she here? Esther, I see your question. Do you want to ask it yourself?
Yeah, I will.
Yeah, Esther, please.
Okay, I want to ask the panelists, all the panelists, in your respective countries, how much has digitalization affected community radio? We have seen, for instance, in Thailand that the number of stations have come down drastically, number of community radio stations. In India too, because of the difficulty in getting a license for a community radio, people opt to go on the internet and do an internet radio, and now podcast is catching up. So I really want to ask, is digitalization affecting community radio in your country? And second, are you able to synergize with digital radio? Because like Imam mentioned just now, for instance, radio can be effective means of communication in education, in areas where there are no smartphones, where there's no broadband, and vice versa, where there is a radio and digital is there, radios can take content and broadcast. So I would like all the panelists to address these two questions. How much of synergization is there, and is digitalization affecting community radio?
To some extent, some of the panelists have addressed this question earlier. I mean, Raymond referred to the weak internet reach in the Philippines. I mean, if there are others who would like to pitch in on it briefly, who would like to go first? Sharon?
Sure, thanks. I'll reflect a little bit on the work I was doing at FemLink with the suitcase radio technology, because that was actually the whole basis of how FemLink started with community radio. It was about taking radio out of the capital to rural women. And I think that was really, that remains to me an important model of broadcasting. But what I mentioned earlier about the costs and also in terms of managing and negotiating around you know, the broadcast infrastructure, etc., that can be quite costly, both in terms of the funds you need to set up the infrastructure, while also at the same time you also need to build capacity within the community radio station to manage all of that. And unless you have a good sort of public-private or community and private partnership that we were able to forge to some degree at the time, I think that will continue to be a challenge. So I think there is potential to use digitalization to some degree. I'm not seeing it affect community radio in Fiji, let alone the Pacific, as much. But I'm a firm believer that there can be a way to utilize digital technology and still use the analog. I think we need to start to think of sort of more innovative practice of creating content and getting content to the people, and utilizing community media processes to enable the local voices, the diversity of local voices, to be part of the democratization process. So it's I'm more of a content person. I think you can use whatever technology is there, but it's really about the content at the end of the day. And right now, we need content that is not just about health education and how to prevent COVID-19, but enabling communities to talk and define the resilience, to bring them out of that space of being too remote, being isolated, and to thirdly, to hold governments accountable, as I said, utilizing, your constitution, human rights treaties, etc., to be part of that movement of realizing equality and overcoming inequalities. Thanks.
Maybe, Imam, do you want to comment on the issue in Indonesia about digitalization and the internet?
Yes, of course. Thank you. Thank you, Professor. I can share that some community radios in Indonesia now have used the internet also to amplify their broadcasts by connecting with Facebook, or YouTube, streaming radio, even on Spotify. They use the internet to overcome the limitation of transmit power allowed by the state, because you know that government of Indonesia only allowed community radios with very minimum power reach only 2.5 kilometers. So those community radio need to reach more than 2.5 kilometers. Then some of them use the internet to get people's to listen their programs. But for community radios who understand that they really serve people in limited area, because they feel that the participation is number one, rather than expand the broadcasting area, they still use traditional using the airwave. So I can say that the community radio in Indonesia using the internet is now less than 5%. But of course, it can be challenged for the next in the futures, because we don't know that many like, for example, as I already mentioned, that even the government have a program online teachings, but we can see that many area of Indonesia, similar with Philippines also and other countries, still have a lot of blank spot area. Then it means that we still need the traditional access media like community radio. Thank you.
Thank you. Supinya, did you want to comment on this?
Yes, I spoke a little bit earlier, but concerning the digital disruption, of course, yes. And in Thailand, it's related to the generation as well. I think radio broadcasting in Thailand is still very popular. People still love it. But for the, older generation, so when talking about sustainability, so, people get older, after 10 years, so they need young generation to run the station, but it's difficult because of the younger generation. They are interested in other media platform, especially the internet. Of course, they listen a lot podcasts. They are on Twitter, TikTok, or whatever you can say, that more interactive. So that left alone TV and radio now being watched by rather older generation, and sometimes when talking about the content that you said, Sharon said that we should make the content interesting. Sometimes, when they targeted the older generation, some of the content somehow could be a bit conservative and reproduce the old paradigm or mindset which contradict to the younger generation that they doesn't want it. And beyond that, in Thailand now there's a conflict between generation because of generation Y, Z or Alpha, millennium, on political issue, on LGBT, on political or sexual orientation, totally different, and they speak different language. So the medium has a message. So that's why when they have different interests, and the platform also represent different content as well. As Sharon said, how we could make traditional media like TV and radio become more progressive or interactive to attract to the younger generation, but it's difficult, at the same time they have their own channel, and their parents or grandparents are not on Twitter, are not on TikTok, and they just lost what their grandchildren talking about. And I think this is some people think that is the big issue, it's a big concern, but some people think that is a great opportunity to challenge the establishment or the old paradigm in Thailand. I don't know. So it depends on which perspective you're looking upon. So yeah, medium is a message. In this case, if we want to change the community radio to become more attractive, we need to change the storytelling on it. But at the same time, it would not be popular for the main audiences that love radio, So I think that's the challenge. Yeah, for us.
If you don't mind staying on for another minute, you might want to respond to this. There is a question on Facebook from the Pakistan Community Media Network. And this is somewhat related to what you said about, there being 184 community radio stations and about 3,000 some commercial radio stations. So the question that the Pakistan Community Media Network is asking is, we have no community radio in our country. How can community radios survive where commercial radios are already working, especially during COVID-19? I mean, you could take it beyond COVID-19. I mean, this is a more general question here.
Okay. So can I come back to answer that later? Maybe I will look at that question again. Sorry, I lost it a little.
No, basically saying, how can community radios survive in a world so full of commercial radio stations?
Yes.
Like in Thailand, like in Pakistan. So,
yes.
So how do community radios survive in such a climate?
So that's exactly the point,
Zarina, I'll call you back.
Yeah. You need more engagement, so that's why you attract the audiences or even sponsorship. But in order to attract that, you need to change the storytelling to attract interest of the people, as I mentioned earlier. So so that's why it's difficult. So I don't know, it's contradiction. You need to serve the traditional audience who love the same story, but may not attract the sponsorship or the even the funders, So, but at the same time, I think I could not figuring it out now. But in Thailand, community radio also stuck in that dilemma as well. So we hope that we could remobilize again and discuss about what issue that you raised, because now people are just stuck and don't know where to go and just let it go naturally. But the question is good and it's being raised among here, but we could not still find the exact answer for the solution. People just try to do their best to maintain the station, but for the bigger picture, it's still very difficult, to really answer your question financially and also in terms of other engagement in the big picture.
Soda-san, do you want to come in on that question? And also I'm relating it to another question on Facebook directed to you by Sapna Nayak here in India from Mysore. She was referring to something you said during your initial remarks about a case study that you spoke about uh, regarding the agenda setting role by community radio. And she was asking if you could elaborate a little bit about it. It may also connect to the Pakistan question about the relevance of community radio in a world of commercial radio stations. Yeah, I mean, if you could combine the two questions and address it.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to put one thing about the generations Ms. Sophia already mentioned. In Japan, the community radio, I sometimes work with senior high school students. And for them, community radio is new media. They are digital native and they don't know about the radio. Some students never seen before the radio devices. And in the schools, but in the schools, I explain about the role of the community radio and the practice of to make program of the to make the program, and they surprised that the voices directly reach to communities. This is a very, very shocking ideas for them. And they started to show their interesting to the community radios. So I think the younger generation and the community radios, we need the mediator to connecting both younger generations and the community radio, especially in the schools. I would like to put this one thing about the discussions of the generations. And now is okay, or other panelists will talk about
No, I mean, if you
setting agendas.
Yeah, if you want to say a little bit.
Okay, I would like to say about the setting agendas. In Japan, firstly, I already mentioned, community media has tendency to avoid talking about the political issues in Japan. They talk about daily life or civil society's attemptation to the some activities for the human rights activities or something like that. But they try to they seem to avoid to discuss about political issues. For example, so I think now we should talk about the political. It's a time to start to talk on political issues through the community radio in Japan. This is my point. So I mentioned about the agenda setting. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks, Soda. Kanchan says she has a short question. So if we can have a short answer to that, we can then go back to the moderator for final remarks. Kanchan, go ahead.
Thank you for letting me ask a second question. I'll keep it short. Sharon has mentioned media democratization. Imam mentioned participation. Raymond has been saying freedom of expression. Supinya said voice of the voiceless. So I'm going to play the devil's advocate. Basically saying that when there is so much emphasis going on accurate information, which should reach out to women, to marginalized women in remote areas and so on, are we running a risk of starting to imagine community radio only as a medium of dissemination of information? So that's the question.
This is to Sharon? Okay.
Absolutely not. I have to say that it's actually, for me, the democratization of the airwaves for women in particular in rural, remote communities for women with disabilities, the LGBTQI community, is first and foremost to be heard at a time where more and more it's about government generated content, and where news and information has become so limited in the mainstream that we need to have the diversity of voices. So for me, community radio or community media platforms are actually about giving the voice to the community first. And maybe to go back also to the person in Pakistan, I think in terms of costs as well, maybe we actually need to start to think about geographical locations of community. You know, sometimes start in your neighborhood. I think people having conversations and having conversations, that to me is what community media is about, and bringing different people together through local community groups, you know, at the park, etc. So for me, no, absolutely not. I think accuracy of information, well, you know, if a head of state says something, does that make it accurate? No. But the legitimacy of voice for me is far more important. I'll pause there. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sharon. I think that's a good sort of positive take on what we all think of community media and its role in contemporary world. Over to Ashish for some final thoughts here.
Well, thank you, Vinod, and thank you once again for this
Ashish, Raymond
opportunity.
wants to say something.
Sure, please.
Sorry. Raymond, sorry, I didn't see you. Yeah.
Yeah, let me say that my work, our work here in the Philippines is to help establish community radio stations. That's only possible in communities who that have organized themselves and have and are saying they want to have their own voice, their own community radio stations to be the tellers of their own stories. It's not a form of dissemination that comes from above, like Dux et Machina. No, that we who work at the capital of the Philippines are just feeding the communities content that comes from us. What we're saying is that the work that we do in community radio broadcasting comes from the communities themselves. It's not giving voice to the voiceless. It's magnifying their voices, helping them magnify their voices. The voice comes from them. And that's what we think of what community radio broadcasting work must be. Well, that would explain why it becomes very difficult for us to put up community radio stations and to sustain them. But it comes from the desire of the community. We do not impose on the community. It's the communities that come to us and say, please help us establish community radio stations because we want to tell our own stories. I don't know if I misunderstood the question, but it's I would like to point out that it's not a form of dissemination of information that comes from above. It's a collaboration, really. We're just helping out the storytelling, the stories, the owners of the stories, and the primary tellers should be the communities themselves. Now, it's another matter if we would be able to sustain them under a very repressive environment, but at least that's what we're trying to set out to do here in the Philippines.
Thank you very much.
I hope I'm understood on that.
No, thank you very much. I mean, Kanchan did say that she was playing devil's advocate. We at the UNESCO chair, like all of you, are very strong votaries of community media and the strong role that it can play in amplifying the voices of the marginalized. Yeah?
Imam is raising his hand.
Okay, Imam, last word.
Yep, I agree with Raymond. It's happened also in Indonesia. I guess around 95% community radio established by their own community, not by other side of like NGOs. So there is no agenda setting. There is no interference from others. And I think that has happened because there is a lot of variations of a program developed by themselves, not by others. We are facilitators, how to strengthen them, how to make increase their skill to produce the radio program. So that's that. The point is, community radio in Indonesia more or less developed by their own community. So there is no agenda setting. Of course, there is no. Yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Thanks, Imam. Ashish, and then I'll do the closing by thanking people. Yeah, Ashish.
Well, thank you very, very, very much, Vinod. After hearing those final observations, I mean, I'm at a loss for words, but I will like to say a couple of words. Firstly, thank you once again for really something that is very, very enriching over here. I think this discussion has really cut to the crux of the issue. And the words that linger in my mind are, it's who speaks, who listens, who speaks, who listens, and also how is the listening done. That is what we need to do as we grapple with the sector today in the pandemic and post-pandemic period. And the words which continue to stay are redefine. How do we redefine? Strengthen. How do we strengthen? Re-engage. How do we re-engage? How do we build our networks? How do we engage with the community? Only then will we get to the issue of who speaks, who listens, and who is the community. Thank you once again for providing so much food for thought. I think, if I may suggest, a way forward is already to start by building on the wonderful work that the chair has already done. These global dialogues are a great way of re-engaging and building a really inspiring repository. So thank you once again, Vinod, and thanks once again, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ashish. So let me thank all the panelists, Sharon, for whom it's particularly late in Suva.
Yes.
Apologies for delaying your dinner and any
No
other
worries.
plans. And Imam, Raymond, Soda-san, and Supinya for being here for 2 long hours and sharing your insights and perspectives on what's happening in your region. Some very sharp points have emerged from your comments and perspectives. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks to Ashish for moderating, not only actually moderating this panel so well, but also for helping us curate this panel. I mean, it was Ashish and his old networks in the region that helped us reach back to some of you and then get you all here. Thank you so much, Ashish. And
thank you.
Let me thank Suman Basnet and Amarc Asia Pacific for coming on board to circulate news about this dialogue through their own networks and lending their name as a partner. And we look forward to doing more things with Amarc Asia Pacific. Thanks to all the audience. I mean, I see people from Africa, from Europe. Bijak Jalav, who is the president of Community Media Forum of Europe, was here. She's probably still here. Vilna from Ghana has been here. Some of you know Vilna well. And so thanks to the audience for being here and joining this engaging conversation. In the next dialogue, we are moving again back to Africa, this time to Francophone Africa. And we are going to have panelists from Mali, from the Democratic Republic of Congo, Burkina Faso, Central African Republic, and Madagascar. 5 Francophone countries from Africa are going to join for the next dialogue. And we are collaborating to put this together with Farm Radio International and also Foundation Hirondelle, which is a Swiss organization that you know is very active in the Francophone Africa. We are also currently working with our friends and partners in Europe to put together a couple of continental European dialogues. Then we'll move to the Americas. So, friends, we are not done yet. So I hope you will all come back to participate in other dialogues. We'll keep you posted through email and our Facebook page about future dialogues. Thank you once again for being here today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Thank you.